Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. This is Mike from the UX+DevSummit, and I'm still talking about Alexa capability interfaces. And as an Alexa developer, you implement interfaces, and if you are creating an interface or device, you support these interfaces by implementing them in such a way so that Alexa can communicate through that agreed contract. So first up today, we're going to be talking about some of the additional interfaces outside of the ones that we've already covered. And in this example, you can think about Outlook or Google Suite. So it turns out that there are capabilities to support interactions with your calendar that are specific to meetings. And the first capability we're going to take a look at is basically joining or scheduling a meeting when used, and this is basically used primarily when you're starting a meeting randomly or in an ad hoc kind of style. So imagine you just need to schedule a meeting and emergencies come up, something is really not planned. This would be the case where you would use this specific type of setting. So essentially, the way that it works is you configure the endpoint, the provider, and protocol, and that's set up in the Alexa console. And then the user, the person who's actually requesting the meeting or joining that meeting, they provide an optional PIN number, and essentially when they're interacting with Alexa, this is the information that they provide. So the other one is pretty self-explanatory. Even though it might not feel like it, I think all meetings have an end eventually or at some point. And this is the directive that you typically use to do that. As you might imagine, there is a relationship between this controller and the calendar, and you can actually use the get current meeting directive on that calendar object and controller to get the event IDs, which can be used as your identifier for the corresponding meetings that you're about to have. So here's basically a breakdown of how that dialogue would look between Alexa and a user. So essentially the user says, "Alexa, start the meeting." Then Alexa sends the information, but maybe she's getting the current meeting directive and using that first to give her a list of existing events or IDs that are currently out there. And then she'll send a response with a event information or meeting information. And then she basically says, "Do you want to join this meeting organized by meeting organizer?" In this case, the user would then say yes, and then Alexa sends this MeetingClientController join schedule meeting directive, and ultimately you end up joining that meeting. So that's pretty much the breakdown of how using this controller would work and its corresponding directives. So for the next set of capabilities and interfaces, you can picture a video or a camera or a TV, something that basically would stream either video or audio. And essentially, I think a lot of these will make sense because this is how things traditionally have worked before Alexa came into the picture. So basically what we're looking at is we want the ability to essentially change input channels on a device. So again, going back with like the TV idea, typically if you take a look at a television, it has multiple inputs on it. You might see HDMI 1 or 2, or you might see some other channel settings like comp, etc. So in this case, Alexa would need to be able to interface with these different input channels so that she could ensure that you are going to watch something and actually be able to see it. So one of the inputs or directives or controllers in this case that you can use is the InputController, which essentially allows you to change that input setting on that device, assuming that it's able to understand essentially that command. And it's implemented in such a way where typically TVs that are online enabled or online capable and that support that Alexa interface will essentially respond to this input change. So in these next set of two interfaces, think about speakers, any device with speakers. It could be a television. It could be essentially anything that has the capability to project sound. So in this case, you might have a series of interfaces where you need to work with a situation where you're adjusting volume, and probably one of the easiest to understand essentially is that ability to adjust the volume settings. So let's say it's playing music at a certain volume. and you know what the scale is. In this case, Alexa knows what that scale is. Let's say 0 is the lowest, 100 is the highest. You can actually specify a specific value, and you can pass that value to a speaker so that it would adjust that setting to a specific variable or value that's indicated within the scale. Now, this is when you have a known range or a known dynamic in terms of the decibels, etc., where you have a scale that you could correctly correlate the value to. So in this case, we can use a value that essentially determines whether we make it higher or lower, and we do this typically through a positive or negative value. So you can also mute the speaker if you need to, and there is an additional directive that supports essentially muting the channel, and that is where we would use this interface. So overall, these interfaces, I think they're easier to understand because we typically listen quite a bit to a lot of different things, a lot of different devices, and so I think it easily relates to everyday usage. This interface is very similar to the previous interface, and essentially the main difference here is that in the last one I was saying that scale, the lowest value and the highest value. In this case, we're dealing with a speaker device with an unknown range of volume, and so think of legacy devices that were in development or in production really long before Alexa came along. That might be the case where you would be using more of these types of interfaces as opposed to the other one. Probably the other one is more easier to work with because you don't want to blow the speakers out. But in the event that you don't know the value, this is the interface and use case that you'd apply that value to. So essentially, think of these as the ways that you can control, sound, sound frequency, and any kind of device which supports or implements these interfaces will essentially be able to understand and adjust those volume settings appropriately. Okay, so this one's a bit of a shorty, but hopefully a goodie, and I think that this will give you even more ideas of what you can do with Alexa, and that's pretty much it. So I'm Mike, and thanks for watching. Check out all the videos, like, subscribe, and remember, sharing is caring. So take care, have a good one, see you next time.